The rust was winning. It was a slow, patient victory, a creeping orange-brown tide that consumed the skeletons of tractors and the corrugated tin roof of the barn. It was in the taste of the water from the well, a faint metallic tang that coated his tongue. Jacob felt it in his own joints, a grinding corrosion that had nothing to do with the biting November wind, and everything to do with the shrapnel still nesting beside his femur. He stood on the porch of the derelict farmhouse, a ghost haunting the graveyard of his own family's history. The paint was a memory, peeled away by decades of sun and neglect, leaving the silvered splintering wood exposed like bone. He'd come back here to die, not with a sudden report, but slowly, like the rust. He would let the memories and the whiskey and the quiet horror of his own survival consume him, bit by bit. This land had belonged to his grandfather, then his father. Men who had built things with their hands, who had coaxed life from the soil. Jacob had only ever been good at taking life. He was a master of the art of deconstruction, a Navy SEAL trained to dismantle enemy lives, structures, and morale with terrifying efficiency. Now that machinery was turned inward. He stared out at the gray, fallow fields, seeing not the tired earth but the ochre dust of Ramadi. The ghosts were always thickest in the twilight. Bravo 3, his team, his brothers, materialized in the shifting mist. Danny, with his stupid, infectious grin, patting his thigh. Marcus, methodically checking the breech of his rifle. Liam, humming an Irish drinking song, impossibly off-key. They were whole. They were smiling. They were a lie his broken mind told him to keep the silence at bay. The real memory was a sound, a click. Not a dramatic Hollywood explosion, but a simple, almost gentle pop, the sound of a god snapping his fingers. Then, the world had become fire and noise and screaming metal. He remembered the feeling of being airborne, a ragdoll in a hurricane. He remembered the smell of flash-cooked dust and something else, something sweet and coppery that he knew with dreadful certainty was his family. He'd woken up in Landstuhl, a patchwork of skin grafts and titanium, the sole survivor. The honor of that title felt like acid on his soul. They gave him a medal, a medical discharge, and a handshake that felt like an eviction notice from the only world he had ever truly belonged to. So he came here, to the place his father had warned him would be waiting if he ever washed out. He hadn't washed out. He had burned out. He was a husk, a shell casing ejected from the chamber of war. He lifted the bottle of cheap whiskey to his lips, the amber liquid a familiar, punishing burn. It didn't make the ghosts go away. It just made them blurry, their accusations softer. He drank until the edges of the world frayed, until the line between the farm in North Carolina and the alley in Iraq blurred into a single, seamless purgatory. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway was an intrusion, a violation of the pact he had made with oblivion. No one came here. He'd made sure of that. The no trespassing signs were riddled with buckshot, a clear enough message. He set the bottle down, his body moving with a fluid economy that was a relic of his former life. His hand rested on the cold steel of the Sig Sauer tucked into the back of his waistband. He wasn't suicidal, he was just waiting. There was a difference. A sedan, a modest, well-kept thing, rolled to a stop. It was as out of place here as a flower in a minefield. He watched, his eyes narrowed, his mind running through threat assessments. Elderly woman, driver's side, no visible threat. Still, his posture remained coiled, a predator preparing an ambush in his own den. The car door opened and she emerged, a small, gray-haired woman wrapped in a shawl against the cold. His breath caught in his throat. The air turned to glass in his lungs. It was Martha Miller, Danny's mother. He hadn't seen her since the funeral, where he had stood stiffly in his dress whites, a decorated fraud, while she had wept over a flag-draped coffin. He had avoided her since, unable to face the clear, honest grief in her eyes. It was a mirror to the guilt he could not wash away. She walked toward the porch, her steps steady, her face a mask of determined sorrow. He felt a desperate urge to bolt, to vanish into the woods like a spooked deer. But he was frozen, pinned by the force of her approach. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him. Not at the unkempt hair, or the days of stubble, or the haunted look in his eyes. She looked at him as if she still saw the young man who used to raid her cookie jar with her son. "Jacob," she said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was just tired. Martha, he managed to name a piece of gravel in his throat. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She knew him. Knew the man he was, and the man he had been. She walked to the rear of her car and opened the passenger side door. A shape moved inside, a shadow in the gloom. When she turned back, she was holding a leather leash. At the other end was a German shepherd, its head low, its tail tucked tight against its haunches. The dog was magnificent in frame, with the deep chest and noble head of a purebred line, but it was diminished. Its coat was dull, its eyes vacant. It moved with a shuffling reluctance, a creature that had surrendered. "This is Kaiser," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jacob knew the name. He had heard it 1,000 times in Danny's letters. Kaiser, the wonder dog. Kaiser, who could find an IED in a sandstorm. Kaiser, who had stood guard over Danny's body until the QRF arrived. They were going to put him down? Martha continued, her gaze fixed on the dog. The program decommissioned him. said he was unresponsive to new handlers, too aggressive, broken. She looked up at Jacob, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of steel beneath the grief. He's not broken, he's grieving. Jacob stared at the dog. He saw the slight tremor in its powerful shoulders. He saw the way its eyes scanned everything and saw nothing. It was a perfect four-legged reflection of the man staring back at it. Two veterans, decommissioned and discarded. Two survivors, drowning in the same sea of loss. Martha Miller walked up the 3 steps of the porch. She didn't flinch from the squalor, from the empty bottle, from the scent of stale despair. She stood before him, so close he could smell the lavender scent of her shawl. She held out the leash. "Danny's last letter," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He wrote about you. He said if anything ever happened to him, he said, give Kaiser to Jake. He'll know what to do." Her words were a gut punch, a direct hit, a command from beyond the grave. He'll know what to do. Danny's unshakable faith, a final, posthumous order. Jacob looked from Martha's pleading eyes to the empty gaze of the dog. He saw the same question in both, a plea for purpose, a hope for salvation. His hand, scarred and calloused, trembled slightly as he reached out and took the leather leash. It felt heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. It felt like a promise. The moment his fingers closed around it, the dog Kaiser lifted his head, just an inch. His dark, intelligent eyes met Jacob's for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, Jacob saw it. The flicker of a soul trapped behind a wall of pain. The same soul he saw in the mirror every morning. Martha Miller's shoulders slumped in relief. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. She placed her small, warm hand over his on the leash. "Thank you, Jacob." He could only nod, his throat locked tight. She didn't stay. She knew this was a fragile moment, a seed planted in barren ground. She gave his hand a final squeeze, turned, and walked back to her car without a backward glance. The sedan crunched back down the driveway and disappeared, leaving Jacob alone on the porch with the ghost of his best friend and the living embodiment of his grief. The dog stood motionless, a statue of misery. The wind whipped around them, carrying the smell of rain and dead leaves. For the first time in months, the ghosts of Bravo 3 were silent. They were watching, waiting. Jacob looked down at the dog. "Okay, Kaiser," he rasped, his voice raw from disuse. "Let's see what we can do." The first 24 hours were a silent negotiation. Jacob set out a bowl of water, which the dog ignored. He opened a can of premium dog food, the smell filling the dusty kitchen. But Kaiser remained by the door, a sentinel guarding a post that no longer existed. Jacob didn't push. He knew this kind of trauma. You couldn't force a breach. You had to find a crack, a weakness, and patiently work your way in. He sat on the floor across the room, cleaning his Sig Sauer, the methodical, repetitive motions a form of meditation. He disassembled it, oiled the parts, and reassembled it, the soft clicks of the metal a language they both understood. Kaiser watched. His ears didn't perk, but his head tilted infinitesimally. He was processing, assessing. That night, Jacob slept on the threadbare couch. He left the bedroom door open, the room where he fought his worst battles in the dark. Sometime before dawn, he was ripped from a dream of fire and sand by a low whine. He sat up, his heart hammering. Kaiser was standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn gloom. The dog whined again, a high, keening sound that was pure anguish. His powerful body was trembling, his legs shaking. Another nightmare. Another veteran reliving the worst day of his life. "Easy boy," Jacob murmured, his voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used to calm a spooked private on his first patrol. "You're okay. You're safe." He didn't move toward the dog. He let Kaiser close the distance. The dog took a hesitant step, then another, until his cold nose nudged Jacob's outstretched hand. The fur was coarse, the body beneath it a coiled bundle of tension. Jacob just held his hand there, a point of stability in the dog's swirling chaos. After a long moment, Kaiser lay down on the floor beside the couch, his head on his paws, and let out a deep, shuddering sigh. Jacob didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He just sat there, watching the dog's flanks rise and fall, a silent guard over a fellow soldier. The next morning, Kaiser drank the water. He didn't eat the food, but it was a start. Jacob noticed that favored his left front paw, a slight but persistent limp. And when he ran a hand down the dog's back, he felt ribs like a washboard beneath the thick coat. Martha had saved him from the needle, but the system had already done its damage. He needed a doctor. The nearest town was a 30-minute drive. It felt like a foreign country. The people moved too fast, their faces unburdened by the things he'd seen. The colors were too bright. The sounds were a cacophony that set his teeth on edge. He found the veterinary clinic, a clean, modern building that smelled of bleach and fear. Kaiser seemed to shrink as they entered, the clinical smell a trigger. Jacob kept a firm, reassuring hand on his back. "Easy, bud, just a checkup." The waiting room was small. A woman with a cat in a carrier, and a man. A big man, thick-necked and florid-faced, with a pit bull on a heavy chain leash. The dog was a mass of muscle and scars, its ears crudely cropped. The man, who Jacob mentally tagged as the Tier 1 antagonist of this particular scene, yanked the chain hard. "Sit, you stupid mutt." The pit bull whimpered, cowering. Jacob felt a cold, familiar switch flip in his brain. The world narrowed. The colors desaturated. The background noise faded until all he could hear was the jingle of the chain and the dog's frightened breathing. This was casual cruelty, the kind that festered in the world like a cancer, the kind he had sworn to fight. The man yanked the chain again, harder this time. Hey! Jacob's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that cut through the room. The man turned, his face a sneer. You say something to me? Your leash discipline is poor, Jacob said, his eyes flat and cold as slate. He didn't move, but his entire posture was a threat. He was a statue of violence, momentarily at rest. The man bristled, his ego pricked. This is my dog. I'll train him how I want. That's not training, Jacob said. That's abuse. And you're not good at it. The man's face flushed a deeper red. He puffed out his chest. You want a piece of this, pal? Jacob gave a small, cold smile that didn't touch his eyes. You should know that a confrontation here ends in one of two ways. You either apologize to the dog and leave, or I'm going to break your wrist in 3 places before you can even register the pain. Your choice. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. A clinical assessment of capabilities. The man saw it. He saw the utter lack of doubt, the absolute certainty in Jacob's eyes. He saw a predator who had just been momentarily distracted from his real prey. The man's bravado crumbled into dust. He stammered something, a weak curse, then grabbed his dog's chain and practically fled the clinic. The room was silent. The woman with the cat stared at him, wide-eyed. Jacob felt the adrenaline recede, leaving him shaky and hollow. He hadn't felt that clarity in years. The dormant machinery had roared to life, not for himself, but for a whimpering, scarred pit bull. A woman in green scrubs stood in the doorway to the examination rooms. She was tall, with intelligent eyes and dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Dr. Eris Thorne. She had seen the whole thing. Her expression wasn't fear, but a cautious curiosity. Jacob, she asked, reading the appointment book. That's me, he said, his voice returning to its normal register. And this must be Kaiser, she said, her gaze softening as she looked at the German shepherd. Let's get you into a room. Inside, the room was sterile and white. Dr. Thorne moved with a quiet competence that put Jacob at ease. She didn't try to force her attentions on Kaiser. She let him explore the room, sniffing every corner. She spoke to Jacob, but her focus was on the dog. Martha Miller called me, she said, her back to him as she prepped a scanner. She told me a little about him. Former military working dog. Yes, Jacob confirmed. He's underweight, she observed, her eyes expertly tracing his form. And that limp. She knelt, not looking at Kaiser directly, and spoke softly. Hey, big guy, can I take a look? To Jacob's surprise, Kaiser allowed it. He stood still as her gentle professional hands ran over his legs, his back, his neck. She found the sore spots, the areas of tension. The dog flinched but didn't growl. It was a testament to his training and her touch. Nothing broken in the paw, she concluded. Looks like a soft tissue strain, probably from favoring it. We can manage that with rest and anti-inflammatories. She ran a microchip scanner over his shoulders. A beep. Okay, got his service ID. She continued her examination, her fingers probing the thick muscle of his right shoulder. Then she paused. She frowned, running the scanner over the area again. Nothing. She put the scanner down and her fingers worked with more pressure, deep into the muscle. That's odd, she murmured. What is it? Jacob asked, his protective instincts flaring again. There's something in here, she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. Deeper than a standard chip. Feels like a capsule, encased in scar tissue. She looked up at him, her curiosity now tinged with concern. This is not standard. Not for any MWD program I've ever heard of. I've worked with the dogs from Fort Bragg for years. She pulled out a different, more powerful scanner, one Jacob recognized from EOD contexts. It was designed to detect non-ferrous metals and electronics. She ran it over the spot. The device emitted a series of sharp-coded beeps. It's a data chip, she said, her eyes wide. Heavily encrypted and shielded. Whatever this is, it's way above a dog's pay grade. This is DARPA-level tech. Jacob stared at Kaiser, who had sat down and was now looking at him, a question in his eyes. The dog wasn't just a veteran. He was a secret, a piece of high-value government property walking around on 4 legs. And now he was Jacob's responsibility. Can you get it out? Jacob asked. Not without major surgery, she replied. And frankly, I'm not sure I should. This feels classified. Messing with it could bring a world of trouble we don't want. Trouble. The word hung in the sterile air. Jacob knew the military. He knew the lengths they would go to protect their secrets and retrieve their assets. An uncomfortable feeling, the one he used to get just before an operation went sideways, began to crawl up his spine. He needed to know more. He needed to see what this dog could really do. Back at the farm, the world felt different. It was no longer just a place to decay. It was a potential fortress. Jacob looked at the overgrown fields, the dilapidated barn, the dense tree line, and saw firing lanes, choke points, and fields of fire. The instincts of the operator were overlaying the despair of the man. He took Kaiser out to the open field behind the barn. The dog trotted beside him, the limp less pronounced thanks to the medication from Dr. Thorne. Okay, Kaiser, Jacob said, his voice low. He took a deep breath, reaching back into his memory, pulling up the fragments of conversations with Danny. The silly code words, the in-jokes that were also training commands. Kaiser, he said, his voice sharp, authoritative. Watch my six. The change was instantaneous and profound. Kaiser's entire demeanor shifted. His head came up, his ears swiveled, locking into place like radar dishes. His body went from a relaxed trot to a coiled spring of potential energy. He moved to Jacob's left rear flank, positioning himself perfectly, his eyes scanning the tree line, his body a living shield. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. This was not a standard MWD response. This was the movement of a trained tactical operator. He tried another, more obscure command, one Danny had laughed about in a letter. Something about a video game they used to play. Kaiser, execute protocol Chimera. The dog didn't move. For a second, Jacob thought it was a fluke. Then Kaiser lowered himself to the ground, his body almost flat, becoming one with the dead grass. He was practically invisible from more than 20 yards away. It was a stealth posture, an infiltration stance. This dog wasn't a bomb sniffer. He was a weapon, a scout, a Tier 1 operator in a fur coat. The revelation was terrifying and exhilarating. Danny had been part of something far more secret than he had let on. And this dog, this grieving, broken animal, was the key. A flash of movement at the edge of his vision. Jacob turned. On the road, half a mile away, a black SUV sat parked. It was too far to see the occupants, but he didn't need to. He knew the look of a surveillance vehicle. He knew the patient, predatory stillness of men who were paid to watch and wait. They weren't watching him. They were watching the dog. Okay, boy, Jacob whispered, his hand resting on Kaiser's head. I think trouble just found us. He backed away toward the house, Kaiser moving with him in perfect, silent unison. Let's go home. The SUV was there the next day, and the day after. It kept its distance, a dark shark circling in the periphery. Jacob didn't call the police. What would he say? A black car is on a public road. He knew this game. They were assessing him, his patterns, the farm's layout. They were professionals. So Jacob became a professional again. The whiskey bottle went into the trash. The house was cleaned, not for comfort, but for combat. He cleared sight lines from the windows. He stockpiled water and food. He dug out his old gear from a footlocker in the attic. Webbing, a medkit, night vision goggles that were years out of date, but still functional. He mapped every inch of his property, every ditch and tree and crumbling stone wall, turning it into a mental battle space. He and Kaiser fell into a routine. They ran the perimeter every morning, the dog's senses augmenting his own. Kaiser would freeze, a low growl rumbling in his chest, long before Jacob could see or hear the squirrel, the deer, or the distant drone of a car engine. They were a team. Two broken soldiers, sharpening each other back into a razor's edge, Dr. Thorne called. How is he? She asked, her voice tight with a concern that went beyond professional courtesy. He's good, Jacob answered, watching the black SUV through his rifle scope. We're good. Jacob, I did some digging, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Off the record. I have a friend who works in military procurement. I asked about shielded data chips in canine units. He told me to drop it. He sounded scared, Jacob. He mentioned a defunct program codenamed Project Fenrir and a private contractor, Aegis Tactical. He said they were ghosts, ruthless. Aegis Tactical. The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of them in the sandbox. A private security firm that operated in the grayest of gray areas, cleaning up messes, making problems disappear. They were known for their efficiency and their body count. Thanks, Eris, he said, his voice grim. Good to know. Be careful, Jacob, always. He lied and hung up. The war had come home, and he was ready for it. The attack came on the third night. The SUV was gone. The quiet was absolute. That's what worried him. The absence of the threat was often the final indicator of its arrival. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple. The wind moaned through the gaps in the old farmhouse. Jacob sat in the dark, his rifle across his lap. Kaiser lay at his feet, not sleeping, but in a state of low-level alertness, his ears twitching at every sound. It started with a flicker. The power to the house cut out, not a storm-related outage. The transformer on the pole at the end of the driveway had been deliberately shorted. Jacob didn't flinch. He had already switched to his gear's internal batteries. He pulled the night vision goggles over his eyes. The dark world bloomed into a ghostly green. Kaiser was on his feet, the fur on his back ridged. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards. He was looking at the front door. I see him, boy, Jacob whispered. 4 figures, moving with practiced, fluid grace. Dressed in black, carrying suppressed weapons. They moved in a diamond formation, textbook entry tactics. They weren't soldiers. They were mercenaries, contractors, Aegis Tactical. They thought they were hunting a broken-down vet and a dog. They had no idea they had just walked into a SEAL's kill box. Jacob moved to the back of the house, Kaiser padding silently behind him. He had prepped this. He had weakened the floorboards near the front door. He had set up a simple but effective tripwire connected to a set of heavy farm tools in the hall. The front door splintered open. The first two men entered, sweeping their rifles left and right. Now, Jacob hit the remote detonator for a series of flashbangs he'd rigged from old camera flashes and magnesium powder. The house erupted in a blinding white light and a deafening shriek. The mercenaries cried out, disoriented. The first man stumbled forward, right into the tripwire. A scythe and a pitchfork, relics of a more peaceful time, swung down from the ceiling like a medieval pendulum. The man screamed as the rusted tines found their mark, one down. The second man, recovering his senses, fired a blind burst toward the back of the house. The bullets chewed through the plaster walls. Jacob was already gone, moving down the hallway to a secondary position. He peered around the corner. A third man was helping the second, shouting commands. The fourth was covering the rear. Professionals. They recovered fast, but they didn't have Kaiser. Kaiser, Jacob hissed a single word, a release command. Fang. A black and tan missile launched from the shadows. Kaiser moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying. He wasn't a dog. He was a weapon system. He ignored the man with the rifle and launched himself at the team leader, the one giving commands. His jaws, bred for power, clamped down on the man's gun arm. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the chaos. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as his rifle clattered to the floor. Jacob used the opening. He stepped out from the corner and fired 2 precise shots. The third man, the one covering the rear, dropped without a sound. Double tap, center mass, the old rhythm, 2 down. The second man, the one who had fired blindly, turned his weapon toward Jacob. But Kaiser was faster. He released the leader's broken arm and lunged, a blur of motion. He didn't go for the throat, he went for the knee just as he had been trained, a takedown maneuver. The man collapsed, howling in pain, his leg bending at an unnatural angle. 3 down. Only the leader remained. He was on his knees, clutching his mangled arm, his face a mask of shock and pain. His sidearm was still in its holster. He was reaching for it with his good hand. Jacob stepped over the groaning man on the floor and stood over the leader. The man looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief in the green glow of the night vision. You're not a vet, the man gasped. You're active. Not anymore, Jacob said, his voice devoid of emotion. He pressed the barrel of his rifle against the man's forehead. You came for the dog. It's an asset, the man spat, blood on his lips. A $10 million piece of government property. We're just collecting it. You killed my friends, Jacob said, the words coming from a place of cold, absolute certainty. The pieces were slotting together in his mind. The IED, the professional hit, the cover-up. Ramadi, the IED that got Bravo 3. That was you, it was a hit, to get him. He nodded toward Kaiser, who now stood beside him, panting lightly, a loyal soldier awaiting his next command. The mercenary's eyes widened in recognition, then terror. He had seen a ghost. You, he whispered. Jacob pulled the trigger. The sound was a dull thud in the confines of the house. 4. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The storm broke outside, rain lashing against the windows, washing the world clean. Jacob stood in the wreckage of his home, the smell of cordite and blood filling his nostrils. He was trembling, not with fear, but with the violent catharsis of it all. Kaiser nudged his hand, whining softly. Jacob looked down and saw a dark stain spreading on the dog's flank. He'd been hit, a graze from the wild burst of fire. All right, buddy, Jacob said, his voice thick. All right, let's get you fixed up. He was halfway through patching up Kaiser's wound with his own medkit when the siren started. Distant at first, then growing steadily closer. Red and blue lights painted strobing patterns on the walls. He didn't move. He finished bandaging the wound, his hands steady. He had done what he had to do. Now the consequences would arrive. The local sheriff, a man named Breyer, whom Jacob had seen in town, entered with his gun drawn, his face pale. He took in the scene, the bodies, the tactical gear, the arsenal of weapons, and Jacob sitting calmly on the floor next to a massive German shepherd. Son, Breyer said, his voice shaking, you have a lot of explaining to do. Before Jacob could answer, a new sound drowned out the sirens and the rain. A deep, rhythmic thumping. A sound that vibrated in his bones, a sound from his past life. A helicopter, a big one. It landed in the field behind the house, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white cone through the darkness. Men in fatigues, real soldiers, not contractors, rappelled down and formed a perimeter. They moved with an efficiency that made Aegis Tactical look like amateurs. A man in a flight suit, older, with captain's bars on his collar, strode into the house. He ignored the sheriff, his eyes locking on Jacob. Captain Wallace, Jacob said, a wave of disbelief washing over him. It was his old CO, the man who had pinned the medal on his chest and looked away. Jake, Wallace said, his face etched with a grim relief. Looks like you've had a busy night. He turned to the stunned sheriff. Sheriff, my name is Captain Wallace. United States Navy. This entire area is now a matter of national security. My men will handle it from here. Wallace knelt in front of Jacob, his eyes falling to the dead mercenary at his feet. You know who this is? Aegis Tactical, Jacob said. Their commander, actually, Wallace corrected. A man named Creel. We've been hunting him for 2 years, ever since Ramadi. And then, the full story came out. A torrent of truth that washed away years of guilt and pain. Project Fenrir was real, a DARPA program to create the ultimate canine soldier, bonding them neurologically with their handlers. Kaiser was the prototype. Danny was his partner. The bond was deeper than anyone had anticipated. The dog wasn't just a tool, it was a part of Danny. Aegis was the security contractor on the project, Wallace explained, his voice low and full of rage. They saw the potential, a $10 million asset they could sell to the highest bidder. The field test in Ramadi was a success, too much of a success. Kaiser was too good. So Aegis decided to acquire their asset. They staged the IED attack. They killed your team, Jake. They killed Bravo 3 to steal a dog. The words hit Jacob harder than any bullet. It wasn't random, it wasn't fate, it was murder. His men hadn't died for a cause, they had died for a commodity. The guilt he had carried, the survivor's guilt, was a lie. He wasn't a survivor. He was a loose end they had failed to tie up. We couldn't prove it, Wallace continued, his voice heavy with regret. Creel buried it. He had men on the inside. They decommissioned Kaiser, listed him for euthanasia, hoping to retrieve him quietly. But they didn't count on Danny's mother. And they didn't count on you. Jacob looked at Kaiser, who rested his heavy head on Jacob's knee. The dog had led him to the truth. Danny, through his mother, through his dog, had given him one last mission, justice. He knew, Jacob whispered, the realization dawning on him. Danny, he'll know what to do. He knew they'd come for the dog. He was counting on me to finish it. Wallace nodded grimly. He always said you were the most stubborn, loyal bastard he'd ever met. Looks like he was right. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, welled in Jacob's eyes. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of release. The ghosts of Ramadi were finally silent, their war over. He had avenged them. He had honored his friend. He looked down at the dog who had saved him in more ways than one. What happens to him? Jacob asked, his hand stroking Kaiser's head. Wallace smiled, a real smile this time. His file is a bureaucratic mess. As far as the Navy is concerned, View K9 Unit 7A4 was officially declared lost in the IED blast in Ramadi. This dog, he said, gesturing to Kaiser, is just a civilian animal who was unfortunately present during a tragic home invasion. A very, very brave civilian animal. The message was clear. Kaiser was his. Their bond, forged in grief and baptized in gunfire, was now official. 1 year later, the rust was losing. New paint, a deep forest green, covered the farmhouse. The porch was rebuilt, the splintered wood replaced. The windows were new, letting in the bright morning sun. The barn roof no longer sagged. It was straight and strong, the tin gleaming. Jacob stood on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. The whiskey was a distant memory. He was leaner, the bloat of alcohol and despair gone, replaced by hard, functional muscle. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a deep-seated peace. Under the largest oak tree in the yard stood a simple stone monument. On it were carved 4 names: Danny, Marcus, Liam, and the call sign for their fallen leader. Bravo 3. Kaiser lay at his feet, his coat thick and glossy, his body a picture of health. He was no longer a soldier on high alert, but a dog at rest, content in the presence of his man. His tail gave a lazy thump-thump-thump against the wooden porch. A car pulled up the driveway, not a black SUV, but a familiar, practical sedan. Dr. Eris Thorne got out, a smile on her face. She carried a bag of what Jacob knew were gourmet dog treats. She had become a regular visitor, a part of this new, strange, wonderful life he was building. "Morning, boys," she said, her smile widening as Kaiser trotted out to greet her, his whole body wagging. "Morning, Eris," Jacob said, and the smile he gave back was genuine. With the settlement from the government lawsuit against the now-defunct Aegis Tactical, and with Captain Wallace pulling strings, Jacob had turned the farm into something new, a sanctuary, a place for other decommissioned veterans, both human and canine, to heal. The backfields were now training grounds, but not for war. They were for building trust, for forging bonds, for teaching broken soldiers how to be men and dogs again. He had found his new purpose. It wasn't about taking life anymore. It was about saving it. He looked at Eris laughing as Kaiser licked her face, at the peaceful fields, at the memorial to his lost brothers. He hadn't brought them back, but he had finally brought them home. He felt a nudge at his hand and looked down. Kaiser was looking up at him, his dark, intelligent eyes full of unwavering loyalty and love. In them, Jacob no longer saw a reflection of his own pain, but a reflection of his own healing. Danny was right. He knew what to do. He had to be broken, to lose everything, to find the one thing that could make him whole again. He reached down and scratched the big dog behind the ears. "Good boy, Kaiser," he whispered. "Good boy."